History loves the spectacle of a bloody civil war, the clash of legions, the crossing of rivers, the thunder of a battlefield. But the most dangerous threat to a superpower isn't always an army marching on the capital. Sometimes, it is a silent, creeping rot that infiltrates the palace while the ruler is looking the other way. In the autumn of 31 AD, the Roman Empire was operating at the absolute peak of its global dominance. Yet, beneath the polished marble facade of the Eternal City, a terrifyingly sophisticated shadow government had quietly taken control of the state. The secret police had been weaponized, communication lines were monitored, and the supreme ruler of the Western world was completely oblivious to the fact that his execution had already been scheduled. This was not a war won with swords. It was a forensic masterclass in information warfare. For nearly a decade, Emperor Tiberius had ruled the Roman world from a self-imposed exile on the sheer, jagged cliffs of the island of Capri. He was hundreds of miles away from the Senate, relying entirely on a single, trusted proxy to run his empire. But that proxy had built an invisible cage around the emperor, filtering every letter, controlling every guard, and deciding exactly what reality reached the old man's desk. Based on the rigorous, chilling records of Roman senators and contemporary military historians, this is a minute-by-minute reconstruction of a forgotten psychological thriller. It is the story of a deeply broken, paranoid dictator who had to outsmart an invisible coup from a remote island fortress using nothing but ink, bureaucratic traps, and a weaponized piece of paper. Before Tiberius could save his empire, he had to survive a shadow cabinet that had already stolen his crown. The Sovereign of the Cliff. To understand why an emperor would abandon the grandest palaces of Rome to live like a hermit on a rock, you have to realize that Tiberius was a man who utterly despised the human race. And the feeling was entirely mutual. If you open a standard textbook, they will tell you Tiberius was simply a cold, cruel tyrant who fled to Capri to indulge his darkest vices. But contemporary historians like Tacitus paint a far more complex, tragic portrait. Tiberius was a brilliant, hardened military general who had spent his youth fighting in the freezing forests of Germany and the brutal mountains of Pannonia. He wasn't a pampered royal, he was a soldier's soldier. He lived in mud camps, chewed on rations, and once saved an entire army from annihilation through sheer, cold-blooded tactical competence. He was a man of absolute duty, rigid discipline, and zero patience for politics. He never wanted to be emperor. He was forced into the role by his calculating mother, Livia, and his stepfather, Augustus, the man who practically invented modern political micromanagement. Augustus was obsessed with controlling every single variable in the Roman Empire, including his family's genetic and marital ledger. Tiberius was merely a pawn on his chessboard. The turning point that permanently broke Tiberius's psyche occurred years before his exile. Tiberius was happily married to a woman named Vipsania, the daughter of Rome's greatest general, Agrippa. He loved her deeply, and they shared a quiet life away from the toxic center of power. But Augustus's biological heirs kept dying under mysterious circumstances, and he needed a political alliance. He ordered Tiberius to divorce his pregnant, beloved wife and marry Augustus's notoriously promiscuous, unstable daughter, Julia. Tiberius was devastated. He begged, he pleaded, but under Augustus, an imperial order was absolute. Roman writers record a heartbreaking anecdote from this period. Months after the forced divorce, Tiberius accidentally ran into Vipsania in a narrow public street. He stopped dead in his tracks. His face went completely pale, and he openly wept, staring at her with such intense, raw agony that the Imperial Secret Service had to step in. They officially forbade Tiberius from ever looking at his former wife again, tracking his movements to ensure their paths would never cross. To make matters worse, his new marriage to Julia was a public humiliation. while Tiberius was away on the northern borders bleeding for Rome. Julia was hosting legendary, alcohol-fueled orgies right in the middle of the Roman Forum, allegedly using the very rostra where her father passed adultery laws to sleep with elite patricians. Tiberius endured it in silent, burning rage, retreating deeper into a shell of cold cynicism. He realized that in Rome, human emotion was just currency to be traded by sociopaths. He grew to view the Roman Senate not as a noble institution, but as a treacherous viper's nest of sycophants. There is a verified senatorial record from Cassius Dio noting that whenever Tiberius left the Senate chambers, he would mutter to his staff in Greek, "Oh, how fit these men are for slavery." He was genuinely disgusted by how low the elite aristocracy would crawl just to please him. When Augustus finally died and Tiberius took the throne at the age of 56, he tried to share power with the Senate. He refused imperial titles, walked the streets without bodyguards, and banned people from naming months after him. But the senators didn't want a leader. They wanted a master to flatter. Every time he asked for their honest advice, they gave him rehearsed propaganda. The psychological exhaustion eventually curdled into a heavy, unadulterated paranoia. He looked around Rome and saw knives in every shadow. So, in 26 AD, he did something that shocked the ancient world. He walked out. He left Rome forever and retreated to Capri, a jagged limestone island rising out of the Bay of Naples. Capri wasn't a luxury resort. It was a maximum security psychological fortress. Tiberius built 12 massive villas on the island, but his favorite was the Villa Jovis, a sprawling complex perched on a sheer, 1,000-foot cliff dropping straight into the churning sea. The logistics of the island were built entirely around defense and isolation. There is only one small, heavily fortified beach where a boat could land. Anyone approaching the island was spotted miles away by imperial lookouts. On this cliffside, Tiberius's paranoia hardened into absolute madness. And this is where the dark historical gossip thrives. Suetonius fills pages with the grotesque rumors that drifted back to the capital. The common folk whispered that the elderly emperor had turned the island into a horrific playground, forcing young boys and girls to act out mythological scenes as minnows in his swimming pools, chasing him through the water. While modern historians doubt the scale of these salacious stories, the atmosphere of pure terror on the island was undeniable. Tiberius lived like a phantom. He refused to let anyone look at him without permission. Suetonius records that if a poor local fisherman managed to scramble up the cliffs to offer the emperor a massive, fresh crab as a gift, Tiberius didn't thank him. Instead, he instantly panicked, assumed the man was an assassin who had bypassed his security, and ordered his bodyguards to tear the fisherman's face open using the crab's sharp claws. When the screaming man cried out in agony that he was glad he hadn't offered the massive lobster he also caught, Tiberius allegedly had the lobster brought out to shred whatever skin was left on the man's face. He was a man trapped in a prison of his own mind, terrified of his own shadow, casting a long, dark glare from his cliffside down onto the empire below. And this exact psychological vulnerability is what created the perfect vacuum for the palace plot. Tiberius was too emotionally exhausted and terrified to read the daily imperial paperwork, manage the endless demands of grain supply lines, or face the treacherous scum of Rome. He needed a buffer. He needed a human shield between himself and the capital. He turned to the only man he believed he could trust, a cold, hyper-efficient military administrator who commanded his personal bodyguard. Tiberius told his proxy, "You run the capital. Filter out the noise. Only send me the things that matter." It was the ultimate mistake of a tired dictator. By handing over the keys to the imperial mailroom and the gates of the capital, Tiberius didn't realize he had just handed over the empire itself. The proxy quietly went to work back in Rome, building a massive, silent infrastructure of treason. Every single letter heading to Capri was intercepted, read, and rewritten by a network of shadow agents. Every report on the economy or military movements was systematically falsified to keep the old man calm. For 5 long years, Tiberius sat on his cliffside, looking out at the beautiful blue ocean, completely unaware that his trusted shield had just become his executioner, and that the invisible cage was about to lock shut. The anatomy of a network. To build a shadow government inside an autocracy, you don't need to win over the hearts of the public, and you don't need the approval of the legislature. You only need to control 2 specific things: the physical force in the capital and the flow of information to the executive. Back in Rome, while Emperor Tiberius was staring out at the sea from his cliffside fortress, the man he had left in charge was systematically constructing the most advanced administrative trap in ancient history. His name was Lucius Aelius Sejanus. To the average Roman citizen, Sejanus was simply the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, essentially the chief of the imperial bodyguard. He wasn't born into the old money, aristocratic nobility of Rome. He was from the equestrian class, the Roman equivalent of the upper middle class. This made him look entirely unthreatening to Tiberius. Tiberius viewed the old aristocratic senators as ambitious vipers who wanted his throne. But Sejanus? Sejanus was a bureaucrat, a loyal hound. Tiberius trusted him so completely that he publicly referred to him as Socius Laborum, his partner in my labors. But Sejanus was a political sociopath of unparalleled genius. He understood that Tiberius's profound psychological exhaustion was his ultimate asset. The moment Tiberius stepped onto the boat to Capri, Sejanus didn't just execute his duties. He began restructuring the very architecture of Roman military power. Before Sejanus took command, the Praetorian Guard was deliberately fragmented. Augustus had instituted a rule where the 9 elite cohorts of the Guard were scattered across different towns surrounding Rome and housed in private barracks throughout the city. Augustus did this for a very specific reason. He knew that keeping 10,000 heavily armed, elite shock troops in one place inside the city limits was a permanent invitation to a military coup. Sejanus walked straight into the Senate and reversed decades of security policy. He approached Tiberius with a beautifully fabricated logistical report, claiming that the scattered guards were growing soft, undisciplined, and susceptible to the vices of civilian life. He argued that if a sudden riot broke out in the capital, the response time of the fragmented units would be dangerously slow. He proposed a massive, centralized infrastructure project, housing all 10,000 Praetorian Guards inside a single, state-of-the-art, hyper-fortified military citadel on the northeastern edge of Rome, known as the Castra Praetoria. Tiberius, reading the report from his quiet villa, signed off on it without a second thought. It sounded like efficient military micromanagement. In reality, Sejanus had just loaded a gun, pointed it directly at the heart of the empire, and put his own finger on the trigger. By concentrating the entire Imperial Guard inside a single fortress just outside the city walls, Sejanus had effectively decoupled the military muscle of Rome from the chain of command. The 10,000 best trained killers in the Mediterranean no longer looked to the distant emperor on Capri for leadership. They looked to the man who stood on the balcony of their central fortress every single morning, handing out promotions, controlling their payroll, and reviewing their lines. Sejanus quietly began replacing every centurion and tribune with men who owed their careers and their loyalty entirely to him. With the physical force of the state locked down, Sejanus moved to phase 2 of the network, the complete weaponization of information. Because Tiberius refused to leave his island, the entire administration of an empire stretching from Spain to Syria relied on a relentless conveyor belt of papyrus scrolls. Every legal appeal, every tax report, every military intelligence brief from the Rhine frontier had to travel by horse to the Bay of Naples, board a courier boat, and be hauled up the cliffs of Villa Jovis. Sejanus positioned his own loyal agents at the docks of Puteoli and the gates of Rome. They established an airtight information blockade. If a provincial governor wrote a letter warning Tiberius about Sejanus's growing power, the letter never made it to the boat. It was opened, flagged by Sejanus's intelligence network, and the governor was quietly marked for execution. If a senator tried to send a private messenger to Capri, Sejanus's secret police would intercept the courier on the Appian Way, confiscate the scroll, and leave the messenger's body in a ditch. Tiberius sat in his sunlit study on the cliff, reading beautifully transcribed, sanitized reports prepared by Sejanus's office. According to the data Tiberius received, the empire was perfectly peaceful, the finances were flawless, and Sejanus was the only thing standing between the emperor and a senatorial knife. But Sejanus didn't just want to control the present. He needed to secure the future. Tiberius was an old man, and eventually he would die. If one of Tiberius's biological heirs took the throne, Sejanus's shadow government would be dismantled in a day. So, Sejanus began a cold, methodical purge of the imperial family back in Rome, using a weaponized network of professional informants known as delators. Under Roman law, if a citizen was convicted of treason, their property was confiscated, and a massive percentage of that wealth was legally handed over to the informant who exposed them. Sejanus turned this into a corporate franchise. He hired bands of brilliant, ruthless lawyers to fabricate treason charges against anyone related to Tiberius. First came Drusus, Tiberius's only biological son. Sejanus knew he couldn't just accuse the emperor's son of treason, so he targeted him from the inside. Sejanus systematically seduced Drusus's wife, Livilla, involving her in a passionate, high-stakes affair. Together, they spent months slowly poisoning Drusus with microdoses of a slow-acting toxin. When Drusus finally collapsed and died in 23 AD, the doctors blamed it on a sudden illness brought on by excessive drinking. Tiberius wept for his son, entirely unaware that the man organizing the funeral was the one who had ordered the poison. Next, Sejanus targeted Agrippina, the widow of the legendary General Germanicus, and her young sons, Tiberius's grandnephews. Sejanus's informants flooded Tiberius's desk with forged letters, altered diary entries, and manipulated gossip, painting Agrippina as an ambitious radical who was plotting with senators to launch a military coup against Capri. From his cliffside, Tiberius read these reports and felt his old psychological trauma flare up. He panicked. He ordered the Praetorian Guard to arrest his own family. Agrippina was beaten so severely by Sejanus's guards that she lost an eye, before being exiled to a barren island where she was systematically starved to death. Her eldest son, Nero, was forced to commit suicide. Her second son, Drusus Caesar, was locked in a dark, subterranean dungeon beneath the imperial palace in Rome, where he grew so desperate from starvation that he literally tried to survive by eating the stuffing out of his own mattress before his organs failed. Sejanus had pulled off the ultimate administrative magic trick. He had used the emperor's own deep-seated paranoia to force the emperor to execute his own bloodline. By 30 AD, the palace plot was no longer a conspiracy. It was the status quo. Sejanus's bronze statues stood next to the emperor's in every public square. Roman senators would line up outside Sejanus's house at dawn just to beg for a 5-second audience, bowing lower to the prefect than they ever had to a consul. Sejanus had successfully built an absolute dictatorship inside a dictatorship. He controlled the guard, he controlled the streets, he controlled the Senate, and he controlled the eyes and ears of the sovereign of the world. There was only one obstacle left between Lucius Aelius Sejanus and the absolute throne of Rome: the fragile, fading pulse of a 72-year-old man sitting on a lonely rock in the middle of the sea. and Sejanus had just decided that he was tired of waiting for that pulse to stop. The day the emperor woke up. A totalitarian regime is an incredibly efficient machine right up until the exact microsecond a single piece of unsanitized data slips through the gears. For 5 long years, Sejanus's information blockade around the island of Capri had functioned with absolute, terrifying perfection. Tiberius was living inside an artificial reality constructed entirely out of papyrus scrolls that had been carefully vetted, edited, and approved by the Shadow Cabinet back in Rome. He believed his family was traitorous, his capital was loyal, and Sejanus was his only salvation. But in the early months of 31 AD, a single Roman noblewoman decided to risk everything to smash the glass cage. Her name was Antonia Minor. Antonia wasn't just a random member of the aristocracy. She was the sister-in-law of Tiberius himself, the mother of the legendary, deceased General Germanicus, and one of the most widely respected women in the ancient world. She lived in Rome, watching in absolute horror as Sejanus's informants systematically butchered her grandchildren, locked down the military infrastructure, and turned the Senate into a functional puppet show. She knew that if she tried to send a standard letter to Capri through the imperial post, Sejanus's agents would flag it. Her throat would be cut before sunset, and the emperor would never know she tried to speak. So, Antonia bypassed the entire imperial apparatus. She drafted a highly detailed, forensic manifesto exposing Sejanus's entire network, listing the corrupted centurions, the bribed senators, the systematic poisoning of Tiberius's son, and the imminent plan for an imperial assassination. She didn't trust a single Roman citizen to deliver it. Instead, she chose a hyper-loyal, illiterate household slave named Pallas. She didn't let Pallas carry a physical scroll that could be confiscated at a checkpoint. Instead, she made him memorize the text word for word, or according to other contemporary accounts, she sealed a secret, coded notebook inside a hidden compartment of a low-value merchant pack. Pallas slipped out of Rome in the dead of night, avoiding the main highways where Sejanus's Praetorian patrols were checking baggage. He traveled down to the coast on foot, disguised as a peasant, and managed to secure passage on a small, low-profile fishing boat heading into the Bay of Naples. The waters around Capri were constantly monitored by Sejanus's naval scouts, but a lone fishing boat delivering supplies to the island's lower docks managed to slip past the blockade under the cover of a dense coastal fog. Pallas scrambled up the rocky, steep paths of the Villa Jovis, evaded the outer ring of guards, and demanded an immediate, private audience with the emperor, claiming he carried a message from Antonia that could not wait for the Daily Mail packet. Tiberius, sitting in his isolated study, agreed to see him. When a message was finally delivered and decoded, the psychological effect on the 72-year-old emperor was a catastrophic, paralyzing shock. Imagine the sheer horror of that realization. Tiberius wasn't just reading about a political opponent. He was realizing that his entire reality for the last half-decade had been a calculated lie. The man he had publicly called his partner in labors, the man whose statues he had funded, the man he trusted to protect his life was actually an absolute monster who had murdered his son, starved his grandnephews to death, and completely co-opted the 10,000 elite shock troops of the capital. Tiberius looked out his window at the grand cliffs of Capri and realized that a secure fortress had instantly transformed into a floating, inescapable prison. He was completely, utterly defenseless. On the island, Tiberius had nothing but a few hundred local guards and a small staff of elderly bureaucrats. If Sejanus realized the secret had leaked, he could simply send 3 warships from Puteoli, land a single cohort of Praetorians on the beach, and have Tiberius choked to death in his bed within 12 hours. Tiberius couldn't call up the legions on the German or Syrian frontiers. Any letter he tried to send across the mainland would have to pass through Sejanus's checkpoints. He was a god king who couldn't even send a text message without his executioner's permission. Right here, the deep, military-grade survival instinct of the old general flared back to life. Paralyzed by fear but sharp with tactical malice, Tiberius entered a state of absolute, manic hypervigilance. First, he ordered his naval lookouts to seize every single boat docked on the island. No one was allowed to leave Capri, and no one was allowed to land without his direct, personal signature. He wanted to freeze the flow of information completely, so Sejanus wouldn't find out that Pallas had made it through. Next, he executed an insane logistical contingency plan. He ordered his treasury officials on the island to pack millions of gold sesterces into heavy wooden crates. He kept a fleet of fast, multi-oared warships constantly fueled, manned, and floating right below the cliffs of the village Ovis. If his lookouts spotted a fleet of Praetorian ships approaching from Rome, Tiberius was prepared to abandon the Roman Empire entirely, board a warship, and flee across the Mediterranean to the wild frontiers of Germany or the East to find a loyal legion that would protect his life. Then he established a primitive, terrifyingly low-tech early warning system on the highest peak of the island. He ordered his engineering staff to construct a massive wooden signal pyre. He had another team cross over to the mainland in secret to set up corresponding pyres along the Italian coast. Tiberius sat on his balcony for days on end, refusing to sleep, holding a brass telescope to his eye, staring out at the distant Italian horizon. If a coup exploded in Rome, the mainland pyres were ordered to light a specific sequence of fires. If the horizon stayed dark, he was still the emperor. If the smoke rose, his executioners were on their way. But Tiberius knew that defensive paranoia wouldn't save his life. He couldn't win a military war against Sejanus, which meant he had to win an information war. He had to dismantle a massive, entrenched shadow government from hundreds of miles away using nothing but pure, unadulterated psychological manipulation. He needed to keep Sejanus completely calm, completely compliant, and entirely off balance while he quietly positioned a knife behind the prefect's back. Tiberius sat at his desk, picked up his pen, and began writing a series of deliberately erratic, confusing public letters to the Senate in Rome. In one letter, he would lavishly praise Sejanus, calling him the savior of the regime, and hint that he was planning to officially adopt him into the imperial family, giving him the ultimate legal claim to the throne. A few days later, he would send a separate letter sharply criticizing one of Sejanus's closest political allies, where he would casually mention that his own health was failing and that he was dying on his island. In another dispatch, he demanded that the Senate send 2 specific pro-Sejanus senators to Capri to be tried for an ancient legal infraction. This was a masterful, toxic game of psychological gaslighting. Back in Rome, Sejanus was completely paralyzed by the conflicting signals. One morning, he thought he was about to become the absolute ruler of the world. The next morning, he feared he was about to be arrested. He couldn't launch his coup because he didn't know if Tiberius was actually preparing to surrender power or setting a trap. Every time Sejanus prepared to give the order to the Praetorian Guard to march, a new letter would arrive from Capri offering him a massive promotion, causing him to hesitate just long enough for the clock to keep ticking. For months, the entire Roman world hung in an agonizing, silent limbo, suspended between an old man staring through a telescope on a cliff and a ruthless warlord hesitating in a fortified camp. But by October of 31 AD, Tiberius's psychological distortion campaign had reached its limit. Sejanus was growing restless. His informants were starting to suspect the island blockade had failed, and the date for the assassination was closing in. Tiberius knew he had to strike the final blow. He dipped his pen in ink one last time and drafted a massive, heavy scroll that would be hand-delivered directly to the floor of the Roman Senate. It was a document that would become legendary in the history of totalitarian power, a weaponized piece of paper designed to execute a tyrant without spilling a single drop of blood on the floor. The wordy letter from Capri. In the dead of night, on October 17th, 31 AD, a lone horseman galloped through the gates of Rome. He carried no weapons, no heavy armor, and no military escort. But inside his leather satchel lay a weapon far more devastating than a legion of shock troops. His name was Naevius Sertorius Macro, a mid-level military administrator whom Emperor Tiberius had quietly appointed as his new, secret instrument of vengeance. Macro had spent the last several days on Capri, receiving intensive, top-secret instructions from the paranoid emperor. Tiberius knew that if Macro walked into the capital and openly declared that Sejanus was a traitor, the 10,000 Praetorians inside the central citadel would immediately mutiny, lock down the city streets, and declare Sejanus the new master of the world. Macro's mission wasn't to fight the shadow government. His mission was to perform a delicate, high-stakes surgical extraction of power under the cover of absolute bureaucratic normalcy. At midnight, Macro executed phase 1 of the logistical trap. Instead of heading to the imperial palace, he slipped into a dark alleyway and met secretly with Laco, the commander of the Vigiles, Rome's ancient, nightly paramilitary force of firefighters and urban night watchmen. Laco was one of the few institutional leaders Sejanus hadn't fully corrupted, mostly because the Vigiles were considered low-value grunts compared to the elite, aristocratic Praetorian Guard. Macro pulled out a hidden scroll signed with Tiberius's imperial signet ring, presenting Laco with supreme emergency powers. For the next 6 hours, while the city slept, Laco quietly repositioned thousands of his night watchmen through the dark alleys surrounding the Temple of Apollo, where the Senate was scheduled to meet at dawn. Just as the first pale light of morning began to hit the marble columns of the temple, Sejanus arrived. He rode in a magnificent chariot, surrounded by an aggressive entourage of senators who were practically tripping over each other to touch his toga. Sejanus was at the absolute peak of his hubris. He had received a brief message from Capri hinting that Tiberius's upcoming letter to the Senate would finally grant him the tribunicia potestas, the ultimate constitutional power that would officially make him co-emperor and secure his path to the throne. As Sejanus stepped out of his chariot, he noticed Macro standing near the temple entrance. Sejanus stopped, his eyes narrowing. Why was one of Tiberius's minor island couriers standing in Rome? Macro didn't flinch. He walked straight up to the ruthless warlord, bowed low, and whispered a brilliant, prefabricated lie directly into Sejanus's ear. Macro told him that the rumors were true. The massive scroll he was carrying contained Sejanus's ultimate promotion, and the old emperor wanted it read aloud to the entire Senate to solidify his absolute authority. Sejanus's face erupted into a massive, arrogant smile. He slapped Macro on the shoulder, walked past the guards, and strode into the temple chamber like a god entering his sanctuary. The moment the heavy bronze doors of the temple slammed shut behind Sejanus, Macro sprang the trap. He ran down the temple steps to the outer courtyard, where Sejanus's elite Praetorian bodyguard was stationed. Macro pulled out his secret imperial decree and confronted the Praetorian tribunes. He informed them that by direct order of Emperor Tiberius, Sejanus was stripped of his military command, and Macro was now their official supreme commander. To prevent a sudden shootout, Macro didn't threaten them. He offered them a massive, instant financial bonus, a cash payout equal to years of back pay, courtesy of Tiberius's personal island treasury. The guards, realizing their payroll had just switched hands, dropped their spears, turned around, and marched back to their barracks outside the city. In a fraction of a second, Laco's thousands of Vigiles rushed out of the surrounding alleyways, locking arms and forming an airtight, heavily armed human wall around every single exit of the temple. The trap was locked. Sejanus was completely cut off from his military muscle, entirely unaware that the floor beneath his feet had just ceased to exist. Inside the dim, incense-filled temple chamber, the session began. The consul took the grand scroll sent from Capri, unrolled the heavy papyrus, and began reading Tiberius's words aloud to the assembly of hundreds of senators. What followed is one of the most agonizing, brilliant pieces of psychological warfare ever orchestrated. The Roman satirist Juvenal would later immortalize it as the verbosa ipsum, the great, wordy letter from Capri. Tiberius had intentionally constructed the letter to be an incredibly long, rambling, and confusing bureaucratic nightmare. The letter began with a massive, over-the-top paragraph praising Sejanus for his logistics, his loyalty, and his management of the capital. Sejanus sat on his golden senatorial bench, puffing out his chest, while the senators around him leaned in close, whispering flattery. But then, a few paragraphs later, the tone of the letter suddenly shifted. Tiberius casually inserted a minor, sharp criticism of one of Sejanus's financial policies. The room went slightly quiet. Sejanus blinked, his smile faltering. Then, the letter drifted back into boring, routine imperial business, discussing the grain tax in Egypt and a border dispute in Mysia for 20 painful minutes. The senators relaxed again, assuming the old man was just senile. Then, another knife. Tiberius suddenly demanded that two prominent senators, known to be Sejanus's closest political allies, be immediately arrested and investigated for corruption. This erratic, oscillating structure was a calculated psychological technique designed to slowly drain the certainty out of the room. Sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, the letter was systematically deconstructing Sejanus's authority without ever launching a direct attack. The reading dragged on for over an hour. The atmosphere inside the temple grew progressively colder, heavier, and more suffocating. The senators, who were master political chameleons, began to read between the lines. They looked at Sejanus, then they looked at each other. Slowly, silently, the men sitting next to Sejanus on the marble bench began to shift away from him. One by one, wealthy patricians quietly stood up, picked up their robes, and moved to the opposite side of the chamber, leaving the most powerful warlord in Rome sitting completely alone on an empty bench. Sejanus looked around the room, his eyes wide with a sudden, dawning terror, realizing that his entire network of political fair-weather friends was evaporating in real time. Finally, the reader reached the ultimate, devastating conclusion of the scroll. Tiberius stopped rambling. His tone turned icy, precise, and lethal. The letter explicitly accused Lucius Aelius Sejanus of high treason against the imperial family, stripped him of all civic honors, and commanded the consuls of Rome to immediately arrest him and bring him to justice. Sejanus froze. He was paralyzed by the sheer velocity of the administrative collapse. For 5 years, his word had been life or death for millions of people. He had grown so accustomed to absolute obedience that his brain literally couldn't process the fact that he was no longer in control. The consul stepped down from the dais, pointed his finger at Sejanus, and ordered him to stand up. Sejanus didn't move. He sat there, staring blankly into the dark air of the temple. The consul had to yell the command 3 separate times. Sejanus, stand up. When he finally stumbled to his feet, he didn't look like a dictator anymore. He looked like a condemned prisoner. Laco rushed through the bronze doors with a squad of armed watchmen, throwing iron chains around Sejanus's wrists. The shadow government that had taken half a decade of cold, calculated murder to construct had been entirely dismantled in less than 90 minutes by a single, weaponized piece of paper sent from a remote rock in the sea. The anatomy of a total purge. The moment the heavy iron chains clanked around Sejanus's wrists inside the Temple of Apollo, the institutional machinery of the Roman Empire didn't just shift gears. It transformed into a ravenous, automated meat grinder. In an autocracy, there is no room for a soft transition of power. When a shadow cabinet falls, it doesn't just disappear from the ledger. It is violently, systematically erased down to the absolute roots of its infrastructure. Sejanus was dragged out of the temple doors and forced into the public streets, escorted by Laco's heavily armed vigiles. What happened next is a terrifying testament to the absolute volatility of public attention and political loyalty. The very same Roman mob that had spent years bowing to Sejanus's bronze statues, offering sacrifices at his altars, and trembling at his secret police network, instantly realized which way the imperial wind was blowing. In a matter of minutes, the crowd turned into a manic, bloodthirsty beast. As Sejanus was paraded through the forum toward the Mamertine prison, the populace didn't offer him pity. They openly mocked him, hurling garbage, mud, and curses at his head. The ancient writer Juvenal records that the mob immediately ran to every public square with heavy iron sledgehammers, violently smashing Sejanus's bronze likenesses into unrecognizable scrap metal. The faces of his statues were melted down in roaring furnaces to be turned into common cooking pots, frying pans, and latrine buckets. The illusion of his untouchable power had been shattered so fast that the human mind could barely process the velocity of the collapse. Sejanus was thrown into the deepest, darkest subterranean cell of the Mamertine prison, but he wouldn't remain there for long. The Senate, terrified that the 10,000 Praetorians inside the Castra Praetoria might recover from their initial shock, realized they had been bribed with their own emperor's gold, and launch a counter-coup to rescue their former commander, rushed through an emergency session. They didn't bother organizing a formal trial. They didn't call witnesses, and they didn't review evidence. By the late afternoon of October 18th, the Senate passed a unanimous decree sentencing Lucius Aelius Sejanus to immediate capital execution by strangulation. The executioners entered his cell, looped a thick hemp rope around his neck, and choked the life out of the most powerful administrator in the Western world. But for an absolute dictator like Tiberius, a simple execution was never enough to satisfy the demands of total security. Tiberius needed to send a chilling, permanent message to every single province, every single legion, and every single aristocratic family from Britain to the Euphrates. Treason against the Caesar is a crime that corrupts your very bloodline. The executioners dragged Sejanus's lifeless, cold corpse out of the prison and threw it down onto the Gemonian stairs, the notorious stairs of mourning leading into the Roman Forum, where the bodies of condemned criminals were traditionally displayed. For 3 long, horrific days, the Roman mob was given absolute, unchecked permission to desecrate his remains. They tore his body apart limb by limb, dragging pieces of his flesh through the muddy gutters of the city until there was absolutely nothing left but a shattered, unidentifiable skeleton, which was finally hurled into the Tiber River to ensure he would never receive a proper Roman burial. Then, the systemic cleansing turned on his family. Under Roman law, an entire bloodline could be legally extinguished to prevent future generations from seeking vengeance against the state. Sejanus's eldest son was executed immediately. His second son was hunted down by the Secret Service and strangled in a ditch. But it was the fate of his youngest daughter that exposes the true, pitch-black depravity of the imperial legal system. Sejanus's daughter was a young, innocent girl who didn't even understand what the word politics meant. Ancient Roman religious law strictly forbade the execution of a virgin. To bypass this sacred religious barrier, without pausing the momentum of the political purge, the executioner was ordered to violently rape the young girl on the stone floor of the prison before looping the rope around her neck and strangling her to death. Her small body was thrown onto the Gemonian stairs right next to the remnants of her brothers. When Sejanus's divorced wife, Apicata, received word that all 3 of her children had been systematically murdered by the state. She sat in her empty house and drafted one final, explosive letter addressed directly to the emperor on Capri. She didn't beg for her life. Instead, she laid out the definitive forensic proof that Sejanus and Tiberius's own daughter-in-law, Livilla, had spent months poisoning the emperor's only biological son, Drusus, years prior. After sealing the letter and sending it via a private courier, Apicata committed suicide. When the courier reached Capri and Tiberius read the final confession of Apicata, the aging emperor went completely, irrevocably insane. The realization that his own daughter-in-law had been sleeping with his assassin and helping him poison his own son turned Tiberius's paranoia into a raging, unhinged firestorm. Tiberius ordered a total, scorched-earth purge of the Roman aristocracy that lasted for 3 bloody years. He locked himself inside the Villa Jovis, refusing to see a single soul, while his new Praetorian prefect, Macro, systematically arrested, tortured, and executed hundreds of senators, knights, and military officers who had ever spoken to Sejanus or smiled at his statues. The prisons of Rome were packed to maximum capacity. Tacitus records that the city became a silent ghost town of terror, where people were afraid to speak to their own brothers, suspecting that their slaves, their wives, or their children were secret informants working for the island of Capri. Tiberius never returned to Rome. He spent the final years of his life pacing the edge of his 1,000-foot cliff, staring through his telescope at a world he thoroughly despised, completely consumed by the toxic, suffocating madness of his own absolute authority. He had successfully saved his empire from an invisible coup, but in the process of saving it, he had completely destroyed whatever humanity he had left inside his chest. The palace plot was over, the traitors were dead, and the sovereign of the cliff sat entirely alone in the dark, waiting for his own pulse to finally stop. The downfall of Lucius Aelius Sejanus exposes the terrifying paradox at the heart of absolute power. The most heavily guarded fortress can be rendered completely useless by a single, unchecked information bottleneck. Emperor Tiberius built a maximum security psychological sanctuary on the sheer limestone cliffs of Capri, but because he handed over the keys to the imperial mailroom to a single trusted buffer, he inadvertently allowed an invisible shadow government to build a military cage around his entire empire. Yet, when the illusion of his security vanished, the old general's cold, tactical survival instinct proved to be far more lethal than 10,000 elite Praetorian shock troops. Without moving a single cohort, relying entirely on ink, administrative gaslighting, and the agonizingly slow reading of a weaponized piece of paper, Tiberius managed to turn the institutional machinery of Rome directly against his executioner in a matter of minutes. He saved his throne, but the cost of that victory permanently broken his remaining humanity, turning his final years into a blood-soaked nightmare of absolute isolation. If you want to understand how this legacy of deep palace paranoia, secret intelligence networks, and absolute administrative betrayal continued to shape the bloody destiny of the Caesars, you cannot miss our next investigation. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment below. If Sejanus had not hesitated and instead launched a direct amphibious assault on Capri, could he have successfully taken the throne, or was the Roman military infrastructure too deeply tied to the bloodline of the Caesars to ever accept an equestrian dictator? Thank you for watching, and we will see you on the next front line of history.